This is Detroit's Morning Answer with John Anthony on FM 92.7 and AM 1400. The Answer.
You've described this as an intelligence failure, but a failure is something that happens accidentally.
None of the intelligence that was coming up talking about the storming of the Capitol, killing members of Congress, or killing my police officers was ever discussed at the conference calls that I was on, at least.
That doesn't seem to make sense at all.
It doesn't make sense. I'm looking at my men and women having their asses handed to them, and my first thought was, I will take whatever discipline there is.
Once things got out of control, for 71 minutes, Pelosi refused to allow...
With the leaders of all the law enforcement, it was a call I coordinated. Not one person on that call talked about any concerns for the intelligence, the attack on the Capitol that we were seeing that was out there. That's what's scary.
This sounds like a setup to me. I'm sorry, it does.
New Jersey State Police beat D.C. National Guard to the Capitol.
Wait, cops drove from New Jersey before the National Guard could get from the Armory on Capitol Hill to the Capitol. Why isn't this story everywhere?
I have no idea.
Wow. That was Tucker Carlson. He had Chief Stephen Son on. You know, January 6th, it still remains one of the most consequential and misunderstood days in American history. I lost a YouTube channel because of my reporting on it. For years, Americans have been fed narratives shaped by politics, sound bites, and headlines. Yet very few people know what actually happened behind the command post, in the halls of power, and in the split-second decision that determined whether the Capitol would hold or fall. My guest today is the man who stood at the center of it all. As chief of the U.S. Capitol Police, he faced a perfect storm of intelligence failures, political delays, and violent realities on the ground. His new book, Courage Under Fire, pulls back the curtain on what really happened and why it matters today as a new committee has been formed to reinvestigate. We're also going to dig into his perspective on America's broader fight for safety, from Washington, D.C. to cities like Chicago. Detroit Morning Answer, please welcome Chief Stephen Son. Chief, welcome to Detroit's Morning Answer. I just want to let you... I'm sorry, I
heck of an introduction. I was going to say, heck of an introduction there.
Now, I have gone on record defending you in so many avenues because I'm also a former police officer and a state legislator. And I have defended you on so many calls. So when I had the opportunity to interview you, I jumped at the chance because I've listened to almost every interview you've given. And I'll say this boldly and proudly. I trust your integrity more than any of those politicians who spoke out against you, sir.
I appreciate that very much. I'll tell you, in the 4.5 years since January 6th, my story has not changed. Some outlets want to hear it, some don't. So I appreciate the time today.
Now, Chief, you called January 6th the biggest intelligence failure in decades. What was the single most devastating breakdown that morning, and why was it ignored?
You know, when you look at it, the number one issue, I think, when you ask it that way, I'm going to say is probably internal to the Capitol Police. You know, my own intelligence, Capitol Police, a lot of people don't realize it's the 25th largest police department in the country. We have full service police department, everything from police officers to bomb squad. I have my own intelligence unit. And whistleblowers, and some of my intel analysts came out as whistleblowers since. We're sitting on enough intelligence that would have been, everything I needed to get the National Guard absolutely approved that wasn't being put into the intelligence assessments I was getting. The intelligence assessments I was getting was indicating this was going to be just like the previous two other MAGA rallies we had in Washington, D.C., indicating now, we knew Congress was going to be the target because everyone was coming to protest at Congress as opposed to the Supreme Court like the two previous ones. Right. So that wasn't anything new. But the intelligence assessment was put out January 3rd, listed no high level of concern. Daily intelligence reports were put out that same day, as well as January 4th, 5th, and even the day of the 6th, indicating a low to improbable chance of any civil disobedience. Think about that.
Yeah.
We now know we had groups, coming that some groups that were planning some issues, that were planning on storming the Capitol. That was never relayed to me. So that, I think, is probably the number one intelligence failure that then cascaded into a number of other issues we had.
Now, your book, it names names and it documents timelines that conflict with what the public was told. What are the biggest lies or omissions about January 6th that Americans still believe?
The number one lie that is still out there, and even Speaker Pelosi continues to push it, and I continue to correct her on her X post whenever she puts it out there, is that Donald Trump failed to provide the National Guard in advance and delayed it while we were under attack. And I will tell your people, my facts are true. I never planned on writing a book. I when I was forced out, I literally was cut off from everything the very next day. And forced out of my office, forced to move out of my office, where they took the assistant chief in charge of intelligence, put her in charge of the agency. But let me set everybody straight on exactly what happened. So coming up on January to January 6th, the Sunday before January 6th is January 3rd. It was the first day of the 117th Congress. Regardless of what day of the week it is, it's always going to fall on January 3rd. It just happened to fall on a Sunday. So we're all working. We're up on the Hill. I was with D.C. Police for 25 and a half years. I did a whole bunch of major events and mass demonstrations with them. But I knew we were going to have large crowds at the Capitol. I knew that I only had 273 officers to put on my entire perimeter, and that included officers for response for any civil disobedience we may have. We had skirmishes in the past, so we expected a couple of flare-ups, but those usually happen after the event. So I went to the Sergeant Arms, and this has now all been proven in congressional reports. I'm required by law, and I'm the only chief of police in the United States of America that's required by federal law, 2 U.S. 1970, that requires that I get permission from the Capitol Police Board to bring in any federal resources, any assistance for my men and women.
Wow.
So on January 3rd, I've got decades of experience, but on January 3rd, I go and I ask for the National Guard to help support my perimeter. And I went first to the House Sergeant Arms, who reports to Speaker Pelosi. When I asked him for the use of the National Guard, I could tell it didn't sit well with him. He kind of tightened up and he said, "No, I don't like the optics." And he was concerned about the optics of National Guard on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't approve it. And then he referred me. He said, "Have you?" He said that he doesn't like the optics, and the intelligence didn't support it. I told him all I'm looking for is National Guard to help support my perimeter, because I knew we were going to have large crowds, and a fence line without people along the fence line, it really isn't going to be that good. So he referred me then over to the Senate Sergeant Arms. So they make up 2/3 of the voting members of the Capitol Police Board. The Senate Sergeant Arms is now the chairman of the Capitol Police Board. Asked me to go over and talk to Mike Stinger, who's the Senate Sergeant Arms. I go over and see Mike Stinger. He's not in the office. I come back a little bit later. I can tell he's already been given advance warning. I'm coming over to ask for the National Guard, and he also won't approve them.
Mm.
So I leave out that day, and this is what is key. A little bit later that day, Carol Corbin, who works for the Pentagon, she coordinates what's called Defense Support for Civil Authorities. That's National Guard support for any law enforcement agency that needs them in the country, reached out to one of my deputy chiefs and said, "Are you guys requesting National Guard support? We just want to know in case, so we can, have it ready for you." And by law, I had to turn that request down.
Wow.
So that's documented. I can tell you for a fact. So Trump's Pentagon offered us National Guard 3 days in advance.
But we were told he didn't. We were told that he didn't. Even the what's his name? The guy that was in charge of it. He said no. There was never a request. What? Who are we to believe?
So when you say the guy in charge, you're talking about William Walker.
Yes.
General William Walker, and they're right. There was never a request for National Guard to come up on Capitol Hill. They have to get a request from the legislative branch. They called over asking, "Hey, are you guys going to be requesting National Guard?" And again, you just got to remember, by federal law, I had been denied, so I couldn't accept that.
Right. Wow.
So I had to turn it down. But it gets even more interesting. So here we are coming into January 3rd. About 12:41 p.m., I'm dealing with the pipe bomb, the first of 2 pipe bombs that showed up over by the Republican National Committee, which is just off the south side of the Capitol. We're dealing with that. We're sending a bunch of resources over there, and I absolutely to this day feel that was a diversionary tactic to pull resources away. But anyway, and at 12:53, somebody looks up and goes, "Hey, we have large crowds approaching our west front." And I look up and I see these 2 large groups of people. If people recognize the Capitol and they look at the west front of the Capitol, that's the one that kind of has the terraces that come down and you have the big reflecting pool.
Yeah.
There's 2 roadways along the reflecting pool, Pennsylvania Avenue and Maryland Avenue, and they go up to 2 circles. at those two circles, I see hundreds of people kind of coming across, and we have fence lines there with probably a few officers, a handful of officers at each fence line. And the groups come up, and I've done a lot of major demonstrations. Usually in the past, you'll see groups approach a fence line with the police. They'll start yelling, maybe holding up their signs, get a little confrontational. And then over time, it'll get a little bit more confrontational verbally, and then start getting physical if it's going to get physical. This fairly rapidly, you had a small group of people, a small percentage in the crowd that got very confrontational very quickly with the officers, started grabbing at the fence line and started pulling it down and swinging at the officers. I could tell immediately this was not looking good because I didn't have a whole lot of officers on the fence line. So at 12:55, I call MPD, my previous agency, and ask them for some assistance. And then I call the House Sergeant Arms, the person I had first gone to on Sunday asking National Guard support. And I called Paul Irving. I said, Mr. Irving, I need immediate assistance to bring in federal resources. Now, mind you, there's 155 National Guard troops within eyesight of the Capitol. They're up by the White House. They're doing crowd control for D.C. police around the Ellipse and some of the metro stations. So we know they're in the area.
Yeah.
So I asked Paul Irving for immediate assistance. That's at 12:58. He says, I'm going to, quote, run it up the chain, and I'll get right back to you. Now, picture me. I'm in the command center. I'm looking at all these video screens up on the front. I'm seeing, the fighting is showing up on the front. Now it's getting physical. My officers are having to back up toward the Capitol as this crowd, literally of hundreds of people, is coming into the Capitol grounds. He has a liaison sitting right behind me. The whole Capitol Police Board, there's 3 people sitting literally 24 inches behind me so they can see everything I'm doing and hear everything I'm doing. They're watching what I'm seeing, so they're reporting back exactly what's going on. Paul Irving tells me I'm going to run it up the chain. He says, I'll get right back to me, and hangs up the phone. I continue to look at the fighting, and I said, I can't wait any longer. I call Mike Stinger, he's now the chairman of the Capitol Police Board, and say, hey, we need immediate assistance. He asked me, have I called Paul? I said, yes. I said, Paul said he's running up the chain. He says, let's wait to hear from Paul. I'm dumbfounded at this. I hang up the phone. I'm waiting. For the next 71 minutes, I make 11 repeated phone calls to say, where am I on my request?
Wow.
In the meantime, I start calling every chief of police I know, saying, hey, send me whatever you can. I activate mutual aid. At 2:09 p.m., I finally call Paul again. He goes, you have permission. 71 minutes later.
Wow.
5 minutes after that, they break the first window of the Capitol and start climbing in the Capitol. Think about that.
Yeah.
The commanding general, William Walker of the D.C. National Guard, had said if I had received approval on that first call, he could have had National Guard there and probably prevented that breach. And congressional reports have even said if the Sergeant at Arms had approved Sun's request on Sunday, January 3rd, Capitol probably would have never been breached. We wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Wow.
So that's the number one thing that people don't realize. Think about that. It took 81 minutes for that group to fight its way up to the Capitol and break its window and break the first window and start climbing in the Capitol. For 71 of those minutes, I was repeatedly denied bringing in any federal resources for my officers.
Now, Chief Son, as I watched the events unfold, I was actually supposed to be there. I'm so glad I didn't come now because I had my airfare, hotel, everything paid for, and I'm just so glad I didn't come. But when you saw the crowd, you saw video. Once the videos were released, Tucker Carlson, thank God he got it all released. You saw some untoward stuff. You saw people who were dressed up as MAGA who really wasn't part of the MAGA. You had Christopher Wray, the former FBI director, saying that he did not know if he had assets on the ground. Well, we know he was lying. We know there were assets on the ground. When they started calling it basically an insurrection, a lot of us got really upset and frustrated. How important is it to understand just the people that were there, who probably were part of this government apparatus, because there's still a lot of questions about that. Is that a fair assessment, a fair question to talk about the people that were there that maybe the FBI were egging on, and who is Ray Epps and all these? There was just such a cloud over this day. Am I making any sense as it relates to these government influences that were in there on the ground and pushing these people to go in, that we're now finding they were FBI assets? Is that true, or is that just this part of this larger conspiracy as it relates to J6?
So I'll tell you, you got a lot of stuff piled into that question there,
Yeah.
John. So let's say this. One, I'll tell you this: the term insurrection has become a politicized firestorm of a term. Nobody's been charged with insurrection. Nobody was convicted of insurrection. And I'll tell you this: if they want to call January 6th an insurrection, let's jump back to May 30th through June 2nd. June 1st of the White House, 2020, when the White House came under attack for 3 straight days. And they had to shut down White House operations. If you want to call January 6th an insurrection, that's much an insurrection in 2020.
Yeah.
And not a single person was charged. All charges were dropped against individuals during that rally. So let's go back to the rest of your question. When you ask about certain things, I think that some of those are really fair questions. Like who is Ray Epps? I don't think we've really gotten clear understandings of that. He has been on TV saying that he was there telling people don't attack the police officers. Well, the people he's telling don't attack the police officers are attacking the officers right after he tells them.
Yeah.
And he's whispering it in his ear. So I don't know. That just kind of raises some concerns for me as a chief. And then for a major event to occur in Washington, D.C., and there not be some joint terrorism task force or some undercover resources from either the FBI's Washington field office, Secret Service Washington field office, MPD, Park Police, monitoring the crowd would not be unusual. What is concerning when you start hearing some of these groups saying, you had people that, whether it's agents or confidential human sources, committing legal violations going into the Capitol or goading people on. There's like some video of allegedly some local police intelligence officers saying, "Hey, you got to go."
Yeah.
That's unacceptable. If that's the case, and you being a former police officer, you realize that that's absolutely unacceptable.
Yes.
You can't entice people to violate laws. So again, I have no proof. I haven't found anything additional for that, but those are all fair questions. Just like how come they haven't determined who placed the pipe bombs?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair question. This is one of the most secure parts of the most secure city in the country, and we can't identify who placed 2 separate pipe bombs. We have video. Allegedly, we have video of the person. I tend to wonder if there's somebody came by later on and actually put it, and this was not the right person. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a new J6 committee forming. What document recording would you most want the new committee to obtain day one? Would that finally answer who stalled the guard and why, and Nancy Pelosi's role in this?
Well, a couple of things. So the new committee under Chairman Barry Loudermilk should be starting up any time. Who knows? I may be one of their first.
I'm sure you will.
Who knows? I've been down. They can talk to me anytime. But I would say, one, Speaker Pelosi's communications were off limits during the Select Committee. I tend to wonder what they get there. I'd be interested to find out what what communications were going on between, like, the Pentagon, specifically General Mark Milley, and members of Congress in the days before January 6th and on January 6th, of any information he may have known. I think it's coming out that he may have known some information in advance and maybe had some conversations with people on the Hill.
Wow, I think about this. Now, let's pivot to D.C. You said you work D.C. police. When you look at what President Trump has done with the Guard and massing a ton of federal police to hit D.C., was that the right thing to do? And now that President Trump is trying to push it off into places like Chicago, Baltimore, he's coming under fire because of it. I believe President Trump is truly showing, to steal a term from you, courage under fire, to bring these cities and states to a point where people can be safe again. D.C. is safe again, correct, Chief?
Oh, absolutely. When you talk about a city that had 497 carjackings, and the carjackings are down by almost 90%, that is a huge difference. And what people don't realize is stuff like this has been done before. We've done task force with federal agencies. We brought in the National Guard to help support in a support role when we do that. We did that in the 90s. We did that in the 2000s. This has happened before, but because Trump invoked Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, now everybody's all up in arms. This thing is working. I've talked to D.C. police. They appreciate the support. I've talked to community members, especially the ones in the high crime areas. They're like, we want to see more of this. So it's done. It's done well. It's worked. I think Mayor Bowser saying, "Hey, she appreciates it's worked, and she's going to continue the cooperation" is smart. I just wish other political leaders across the country would follow suit, and they got to do something with these repeat offenders being released and walking the street and victimizing our community.
If you're just joining the show, we're talking to Chief Stephen Son. He's the former chief, U.S. Capitol Police, and you're truly a veteran of major crisis and national events throughout. And I really do hope President Trump uses you for that as it relates to when you look at. We got about a minute and 30 seconds left. When you look at everything that happened, the communication failures. What should be implemented? What if you were to advise President Trump, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, what would you advise them of how to fix it so that we will never have another J6 again?
Well, boy, you got to make sure one, it's so bureaucratic on the Hill, and the problem is that's the legislative branch. You know, the executive branch, legislative branch. The legislative branch has to clear up the bureaucracy of security on the Hill. They've got too much oversight. They've got a Capitol Police Board that's, still causes a lot of issue. They changed the law. They realized what they did wrong on January 6th and changed the law that now allows the chief to bring in resources in an emergency. But it still has the very last sentence says Congress may revoke it. So think about it. You've got members of Congress that have never walked a footbeat in their life, going to make legal decisions or law enforcement and security decisions over a chief. So they need to just clear that up. And as far as, what we have going on across the country, we've got an issue with our DAs, and our criminal justice system that is favoring criminals over the community.
Well, you know what, Chief Son, I'm going to figure out a way to get you to either Michigan or Illinois to come talk, do a book signing, and have a fireside chat about this, especially as this new committee heats up. Where can people get your book really quickly?
It's on Amazon. Get the paperback. Paperback's the most up to date. It's actually been out for almost 2 years, but the paperback's been out for just a little bit. I'd get the paperback. Amazon's a great place to get it, but I'd love to talk to you further.
Yes, please. Chief Stephen Son, thanks so much for joining us on Detroit's Morning Ask. Folks, go get his book because I know I'm going to go get it. I'm actually going to go on Amazon during the break to get this book. Thank you so much for joining us. Guys, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.